The first thing they told me when I arrived at the station was that hunger kills slower than curiosity. At first I thought they were joking, but then they handed me a list of 11 rules that I had to follow if I wanted to survive in the trench. Some of them made sense, others felt like madness, but they swore each one was carved in blood and fear. I remember the night I broke the first rule. It started with a single bite and ended with something pressing its weight against the walls. Down here, even dinner can decide who lives and who doesn't. When I first stepped into the galley of the trench station, the smell of recycled air mixed with faint traces of boiled rice and disinfectant. The captain had handed me a written set of instructions, each line underlined with red ink, and the very first one was Rule 1, always eat last, no matter how hungry you are. At the time, I dismissed it as an initiation prank. I'd cooked for oil rigs, fishing boats, even a submarine once, and never in my life had I been forced to wait for scraps. But the crew didn't smile when I read it aloud. They simply nodded, their faces pale, their eyes shadowed by months of pressure and darkness. The first dinner I served was a watery stew, stretched thin between 12 people. I ladled portions carefully into each bowl, the steam rising against my face, my stomach aching with hunger from a day of travel and orientation. The bowls emptied quickly, and only a thin smear of broth clung to the bottom of the pot. I hesitated, staring into it, before scraping what I could onto my plate. My portion barely covered the bottom. When I sat down at the far end of the table, the captain gave me a look, not approving, not disapproving, just cold acknowledgement that I had followed the order. Around me, the crew ate in silence, their spoons clinking against metal like a slow countdown. Over the next few days, the pattern repeated. I cooked, served, and then waited. Sometimes the crew left me enough to make a small meal. Other times I had to settle for crusts or dregs. No one offered to save me extra. No one thanked me for cooking. Instead, I felt their eyes on me, measuring, making sure I never broke rank. The hunger clawed at me though, especially during long shifts when the smell of baking bread or roasting canned meat filled the air. I began to dread meal times, not because of the work, but because of the waiting, the watching. My role had turned into a test, and I didn't understand why. On the 6th night, the supply sub dropped a rare shipment, fresh apples. The sight of them in the crate nearly brought tears to my eyes. I sliced them into even wedges, arranging them neatly on a tray, their sweet scent filling the galley with a memory of orchards under sunlight. My hands trembled as I cut, the juice slicking my fingers, and then I thought, what would it matter if I took just one? No one would notice a missing wedge. My stomach growled so loudly it echoed against the steel counters. I lifted a slice, brought it close enough to feel the cool skin against my lips, and that's when the walls shifted. It wasn't the usual groan of steel under pressure. This sound carried weight, dragging itself deliberately along the outer hull. The plates vibrated under my palms, and for one terrifying second, I thought they would buckle inward. I froze with the apple slice halfway to my mouth, my breath stuck in my throat. The air in the galley grew heavy, pressing against me like the deep ocean itself had crept inside. Then slowly, the sound faded, leaving me trembling and drenched in sweat. The apple slipped from my fingers, clattering to the floor, its pale flesh bruising on impact. The crew entered moments later, their faces tense. No one spoke of the sound, though I could see in their eyes that they'd heard it too. They filed into place, bowls in hand, waiting for their shares of dinner. As I served them, the junior biologist Anders watched me with unnerving intensity. He picked up an apple slice, turned it over slowly, then raised his gaze to mine. "You didn't, did you?" he asked softly, his voice carrying a note of fear. I forced a smile, shaking my head, and he nodded once before biting into the fruit. But his eyes never left me as he chewed, and the juice dripping down his chin looked almost like blood in the harsh overhead light. That night, I lay awake in my bunk, the memory of the dragging sound gnawing at me more than the hunger. My mind replayed the moment, the vibration in the walls, the way the air thickened, the feeling of being observed. I told myself it was pressure shifts, nothing more, yet the timing was too precise. It had happened the exact second I tried to eat first. Was that coincidence, or something worse? The captain's words came back to me, spoken when he'd first handed me the rule sheet. The trench listens. I hadn't understood then. I wasn't sure I wanted to now. The temptation to test the rule again grew stronger with each passing day. Hunger made me reckless, whispering that maybe the sound had been in my imagination. Maybe the rule was nothing more than superstition passed down by a paranoid crew. Still, the memory of Anders' sharp gaze and the unspoken fear in the others kept me from breaking. Instead, I waited, serving them scraps of meat, powdered potatoes, rehydrated vegetables, until my body felt light, hollowed out. Sometimes, when I stood at the sink scrubbing dishes, I would glance toward the observation windows and imagine vast shapes moving in the abyss. Once I thought I saw a shimmer ripple across the glass, but when I blinked it was gone. On the 14th day, something changed. Dinner had just ended, and I was scraping leftovers into the waste chute when a scream split the air. I rushed into the corridor, finding Anders clutching his stomach, convulsing. His bowl lay overturned on the floor, untouched food spreading across the tiles. The captain knelt beside him, shouting orders, but I noticed the detail first. Anders hadn't waited. He had taken his portion before the others, ignoring the order. The crew stared in horror as his body twisted, his skin paling until it looked translucent, veins pulsing beneath like dark threads. And then, just as suddenly as it began, he fell still. Dead silence followed. They carried him to the storage room without a word. No one explained, no one asked, but as they passed, each set of eyes flicked toward me, silently reminding me why the first rule existed. Later, when I cleaned the galley alone, I thought I heard the dragging sound again, faint, circling the hull. This time, I didn't doubt it. Something waited outside, watching, punishing, and it knew when the order of the meal was broken. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I sat on my bunk with the list of rules in my hand, the ink smudged from constant folding. I traced the first one with my thumb, feeling the weight of it settle into my bones. Hunger was dangerous, but not as dangerous as what lingered beyond the glass. I didn't need anyone to tell me anymore. I had seen enough. The rules weren't written for tradition. They were survival, plain and simple, and breaking them meant inviting the trench inside. The night Anders died, I stayed awake, replaying his convulsions in my mind, the way his skin had drained of color until it seemed stretched thin over bone. The image clung to me, even as the crew moved on in silence, as if death was routine down here. I tried distracting myself with work, but when I stood at the sink, hands in lukewarm water, I remembered the list and paused. Rule 2. Never clean the galley after midnight. The sentence had made me laugh when I first read it. It sounded like something from a children's ghost story, but with Anders gone, I wasn't laughing anymore. The clock on the wall ticked toward midnight as I scrubbed at a stubborn stain on a pot. The crew had left hours ago, scattered to bunks or watch shifts, leaving me alone with the hum of machinery and the faint creak of steel. I could have stopped, left the dishes for morning, but old habits pushed me to keep working. I hated leaving things dirty. My mother used to scold me for it, her voice sharp in my memory. Clean kitchen, clean conscience. I almost convinced myself the rule was superstition, nothing more, almost. Then the station's lights flickered. It wasn't unusual for the power to dip under pressure, but this time the flicker lingered, stretching seconds into eternity. The galley sank into half-darkness, the overhead lamps pulsing weakly as though struggling to stay alive. My reflection wavered in the observation window, pale and distorted, and behind it, just for a heartbeat, I thought I saw something else. A smear of movement in the black water, pressing close against the glass. I dropped the pot with a clang that echoed down the corridor. The light snapped back to full strength. The window showed only my reflection again, but I couldn't shake the feeling I had been caught. like a thief with his hand in someone else's pocket. I backed away from the sink, heart pounding, whispering to myself that I'd done enough. Yet when I turned, the galley door was closed. I didn't remember shutting it. Slowly, I reached for the handle, but the steel felt warm beneath my palm, almost alive. I jerked back, bile rising in my throat. Somewhere deep in the hull, I heard that same dragging sound I had first encountered with the apple, long, deliberate, circling. I imagined a vast body brushing against the station, testing its walls. My breath fogged the air. Though the galley wasn't cold, it was heavy, oppressive, as though the very ocean leaned closer to listen. I stood frozen until the clock ticked past midnight, its hands clicking with unnerving precision. The air shifted instantly. The hum of the station dimmed, and a low vibration thrummed under my feet, like the heartbeat of something immense. I couldn't stay. I shoved the dishes aside, soap and water spilling over the counter, and bolted for the door. The handle turned cold the moment I touched it, cold enough to bite into my skin, but it opened easily this time. I stumbled into the corridor, the galley lights flickering one last time behind me before stabilizing. When I glanced back, I swore I saw shadows moving across the counters, slow and deliberate, like fingers tracing every surface I'd touched. The next morning, the galley was spotless, pots scrubbed, floors gleaming, not a single trace of my panicked exit. I stood in the doorway, my heart hammering, because I knew I hadn't finished. I hadn't even rinsed the last dishes, but someone or something had. The captain appeared behind me, silent as ever. "You almost broke it, didn't you?" he asked. His tone wasn't angry, just resigned. I tried to deny it, but my trembling voice gave me away. He nodded once. "The rules aren't for show. You're still breathing because you stopped." Then he walked away, leaving me with more questions than answers. I asked Anders' bunkmate about the galley rule later, lowering my voice so others wouldn't hear. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes rimmed red from lack of sleep. "You think this place is dead after midnight," he whispered. "It isn't. Things move. Things come closer." His gaze flicked toward the window, as though expecting to see something watching. "We learned that the hard way. You don't want to see what cleans up after us." He wouldn't say more, no matter how I pressed him. That evening, when the crew gathered for dinner, I noticed how none of them lingered in the galley past a certain hour. As soon as their bowls were scraped empty, they vanished into their quarters or workstations, leaving me alone to clean. My hands shook as I scrubbed the dishes, glancing at the clock every other second. The moment it neared midnight, I dropped everything and backed away. I couldn't risk another flicker, another glimpse of those shifting shadows. My hunger, I could endure. My nerves I could grit through, but not that. Not again. Still, curiosity gnawed at me worse than hunger. I wanted to know what happened to those who broke the second rule. What did they see? What touched the counters after midnight? The memory of Anders convulsing on the floor replayed in my mind, and I wondered if he had once ignored this same warning. Maybe his death had less to do with eating first, and more with what came afterward. Maybe the trench had more than one way of punishing us. That night, I dreamed of the galley, bathed in a strange glow. The counters gleamed, wet with something thicker than water, and the pots dripped with black sludge. In the dream, I was cleaning long after midnight, but the sponges weren't in my hands. They were in long, pale limbs stretching from the shadows. They moved faster than I could, scrubbing, scraping, polishing, all while a low hum vibrated in the walls. I woke gasping, sweat slicking my skin, my hands aching as though I'd been working for hours. By the time morning came, I didn't need another reminder. I followed the second rule as faithfully as the first, never allowing myself to clean once the clock neared midnight. Even when dishes piled high, even when my instincts screamed at me to tidy up, I left them. Better to endure mess than risk the trench's attention. But in the back of my mind, a question lingered, one that made my stomach knot tighter with each passing day. If I had been foolish enough to finish the cleaning that night, Would I still be here to tell this story, or would something else be telling it through me? The days blurred together after Anders' death. A cycle of cooking, serving, cleaning, and trying to sleep through the creaks and groans of the station. I clung to the rules like lifelines, repeating them under my breath whenever hunger or curiosity threatened to undo me. The third one felt ridiculous when I first read it. Rule 3. Never answer the intercom after 3 a.m. I had chuckled, imagining prank calls echoing through steel corridors, but now I knew better. Every rule carried a cost if broken, and by the time I experienced the intercom for myself, I realized this one was far worse than superstition. The first time it happened, I was lying awake in my bunk, too wired from nightmares of pale limbs scrubbing the galley to sleep. The station was quiet, only the distant hum of pumps and the faint groan of shifting metal. Then, out of nowhere, the intercom on my wall crackled to life. A hiss of static filled the room, followed by a voice, low, strained, barely human. "Cook," it whispered, the syllables dragging, distorted. My blood froze. I sat up, staring at the speaker, half expecting it to erupt with more noise. The clock on the wall read 3:07 a.m. I forced myself to stay still, not daring to move. The voice came again, louder this time, insistent. "Cook, answer me." It sounded like the captain, but wrong, like his throat had been filled with water. My hand twitched toward the button, an automatic instinct drilled from years on rigs and ships, where the intercom meant orders, emergencies, survival. But my other hand gripped my thigh hard enough to hurt, anchoring me. The rule screamed in my head, "Do not answer. Do not answer." My breath came in shallow gasps as the voice repeated my name again and again, each time stretched further, as though whoever was speaking drifted farther into the abyss. The intercom finally went silent, after what felt like hours, though the clock said only 5 minutes had passed. I lay back, trembling, listening to the station's hum. Just as I began to believe it was over, a knock echoed faintly through the wall near my bunk. Not the sound of metal straining, not the shuffle of boots, knuckles, deliberate, slow, 3 knocks, evenly spaced, directly where my head rested. I pressed my palms over my ears, shaking, whispering the rules under my breath, until sleep finally took me. The next morning, I asked the captain if he'd used the intercom during the night. His eyes hardened immediately. "You didn't answer, did you?" When I shook my head, he gave a curt nod. "Good. Don't ever. It isn't us." He refused to elaborate, turning away as if the subject were already closed. But the look in his eyes stayed with me, a flash of fear, rare for a man who had faced years beneath crushing pressure. It wasn't just protocol, he believed in it. He needed me to believe too. A week later, one of the newer technicians broke the rule. His name was Ellis, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, who thought the rules were a joke. That night, I woke to the sound of his laughter, echoing faintly through the ventilation. Curious, I slipped out of my bunk, padding down the corridor. The intercom in the galley glowed red. I stopped just outside the door, heart hammering, as Ellis's voice rang out, mocking. "Very funny, Captain. You almost sound like a drowning man. Try harder." He pressed the button again, leaning into it. "Hello? Who is this?" The response that came through made my skin crawl. A chorus of voices, overlapping male and female, some high-pitched, some guttural, all speaking at once. "Ellis," they sang, the name stretched and broken into dozens of tones. He staggered back, his grin faltering, but he didn't let go of the button. Instead, he shouted, "What are you?" His voice cracked, no longer mocking. The intercom hissed, then fell silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then came the knock, 3 times deliberate, on the observation glass by the galley. Ellis spun, pale as death. I stood frozen in the corridor, unable to move, as the knocking grew louder, faster, until the entire wall shuddered. He screamed and bolted toward me, but before he reached the doorway, the lights flickered and went out. In that suffocating darkness, I heard something wet and heavy dragging across the galley floor. When the emergency light snapped on seconds later, the room was empty. Ellis was gone. Only the intercom remained, its light dead, as though it had never been used. The crew didn't ask what happened to Ellis. His bunk was stripped by morning, his name scratched off the roster. They carried on as if he had never existed. I tried to bring it up once, but the captain shut me down with a single look, the kind that could cut a man in half. "The trench keeps what it takes," he said, and that was the end of it. But I couldn't forget the sound of the voices, the way they had spoken in unison, like a choir of drowning throats. Since that night, I've never so much as glanced at the intercom after dark. I learned to sleep with my blanket pulled over my head, hands clenched, to keep from reaching for the button in my dreams. Sometimes the static returns, whispering through the halls. Sometimes I hear my name, or the voices of my crewmates, distorted and calling for help. I force myself to stay still, heart hammering, until the noise fades. Because I know now, the moment I answer, the moment I give in, it won't be me who walks away in the morning. The rules weren't meant to be tested. They were carved from the bones of those who had tried and failed before me. Ellis was only the latest, and as I lay awake, listening to faint static bleed through the walls, I realized something far worse than the voices themselves. They knew my name. They knew I was listening, and each night, they sounded closer. After Ellis disappeared, the station grew quieter in ways I couldn't explain. No one mentioned his name, no one looked at his empty bunk, and no one acknowledged the gap he left in our routines. But I couldn't forget. Every time I walked through the galley, I half expected to see him hunched over a pot, grinning like nothing had happened. Instead, the galley had a heaviness to it, a charged stillness that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. That was when I began to understand Rule 4. Never clean the galley alone. At first, it seemed like the simplest of the rules. Cleaning was routine work, nothing threatening about scrubbing counters or wiping tables. But the others followed it with a precision that unnerved me. No one ever lingered in the galley, unless 2 or more were present. If one finished early, they waited until another arrived before leaving. Even the captain respected it, though I caught him watching the galley with an intensity that suggested there was more to the rule than superstition. I learned why one night, after a particularly messy dinner shift, the crew had been restless, snapping at each other over burnt rations and the endless damp that clung to every corner of the station. Tempers boiled over, and when the shouting ended, they stormed out one by one, leaving dishes piled high and food smeared across the tables. I stayed behind, annoyed but resigned. Cleaning had become second nature to me, and I figured the sooner I started, the sooner I could rest. By the time I realized I was alone, the door had already slid shut. The silence hit me immediately. It wasn't the ordinary quiet of a sleeping station. It was oppressive, as if the galley itself held its breath. I told myself it was fine, just plates and rags, nothing to fear. But when I turned to the sink, the reflection in the metal basin made me pause. My face stared back, but there was something off. The features were blurred, water warped, as though I were looking at myself submerged, and yet the water in the sink was perfectly still. I shook it off and began scrubbing, but with each movement, the reflection seemed to lag, a split second behind me. My stomach twisted. I dropped the rag and backed away. The reflection didn't. It stood perfectly still, eyes locked on mine, a faint curl of a smile forming at the corners of its mouth. The overhead light flickered, and the reflection moved. Not with me, with itself. Its hand rose, pressing flat against the metal surface from the inside. My breath caught as the sink bulged outward, just slightly, as though the barrier between us had softened. A wet, hollow sound echoed in the galley, like someone knocking from underwater. I bolted for the door, slamming my hand on the panel. Nothing happened. The door stayed sealed. Behind me, the reflection's grin widened, impossibly wide, its teeth stretching too long, too sharp. The knocking grew louder, joined by whispers slithering from the walls, soft and overlapping. They weren't words I could understand, but I felt them sink into me, cold and heavy. My knees threatened to buckle. Then, just as the reflection leaned forward as if to break free, the door hissed open. A hand grabbed my arm and yanked me into the corridor. It was Harrow, one of the older engineers. His face pale, eyes narrowed. He slammed the door shut behind us, locking it manually. I collapsed against the wall, gasping. "You were alone," he hissed, as though I had broken some sacred vow. "You don't ever do that, ever." His hands trembled as he adjusted the lock, muttering under his breath. When I tried to explain what I'd seen, he shook his head violently. "Don't you feed it by speaking." Then he walked away, leaving me shaking in the hallway. I didn't step into the galley again for days, not without someone beside me. The others seemed to sense what had happened, though no one spoke of it directly. They only glanced at me with a mix of pity and warning. I caught the captain watching me during meals, his expression unreadable, but I could feel the unspoken message in his gaze. "You've seen it now. You understand." Weeks passed, and the galley incidents grew more frequent. Reflections and utensils grinned when no one smiled. Shadows clung to the corners, darker than they should be, shifting when backs were turned. Once I saw a crewman drop a fork, and when he bent to pick it up, his reflection in the floor's polished steel lingered behind, crouched and staring upward with hollow eyes. He went pale and left his meal untouched. But the worst happened when a junior diver named Roe ignored the rule entirely. She thought herself braver, stronger, immune to the superstitions of the rest of us. One night, when the rest of the crew were busy with maintenance, she volunteered to tidy the galley alone. "It's just dishes," she scoffed, brushing off the captain's warning. "I can handle a sink." She never came back. We found the galley spotless, every plate and counter shining, every table gleaming. At first, it looked like she had done the job perfectly. But then we noticed the sink, full of water, despite no one having run it. In its surface, Rose's face stared up at us. Not screaming, not panicked, smiling. Her eyes followed us as we moved around the room. The captain ordered the galley, sealed for 3 days after that, and none of us protested. From then on, the rule wasn't just a guideline, it was gospel. I never entered the galley without at least 2 others, and I never lingered to look into the reflections. Even then, I could feel the pull of whatever waited beneath those polished surfaces. It wanted attention. It wanted company. And I knew deep down it wanted me most of all, because I had almost answered its smile once before. The rules weren't about safety anymore, they were about survival. And with each one broken, the station grew hungrier. The first time the lights flickered, I thought it was nothing more than the station's aging electrical systems, giving out under the crushing weight of the trench. Power surges happened from time to time, and no one panicked about them. But when the flickering became more frequent, the entire crew grew restless, glancing upward whenever the ceiling lights sputtered. That was when I remembered Rule 5. If the lights flicker, count to 10 before moving. It seemed strange at first, counting instead of fixing. Harrow, ever the practical one, explained that the problem wasn't technical. "The lights warn us," he muttered one evening, as we sat at our bunks. "When they flicker, something is moving through the walls, something that doesn't belong in the spaces we built." His voice was grim, and though I wanted to laugh, I couldn't. Not after what I had seen in the galley sink. The next night, I experienced it for myself. I was carrying a tray of supplies down the central corridor when the lights overhead began to shiver. Not just a dimming, but a sharp, irregular flutter, like a pulse. I froze in place, Harrow's words echoing in my head. My instincts screamed to run, but I forced myself still and began to count silently. 1, 2, 3. Each second dragged like an eternity, the air pressing heavier with each number. By the time I reached 7, The shadows in the corridor stretched unnaturally long. They spilled out across the floor, bending in directions they shouldn't, reaching for me like fingers. At 9, I saw the faint outline of something slithering along the wall, half seen through the quivering light. My breath caught, but I didn't move. And then 10. The light steadied, the shadows snapped back into place, and the corridor looked normal again. I stumbled forward, clutching the tray so tightly my knuckles ached. When I told the captain, he only nodded. That's why the rule exists. If you move before 10, it notices. He didn't explain what it was, but the warning was clear enough. From that moment on, whenever the lights flickered, I stood frozen, counting with my heart pounding in my throat. One night, though not everyone remembered, it was Ellis's bunkmate, a quiet man named Dyer, who rarely spoke at meals. He was in the rec room when the lights began their strange pulse. I had been there too, playing cards with another crewman. The flicker started, and instinctively, I stopped moving, staring at the ceiling and silently counting. But Dyer didn't. He rose from his chair, grumbling about the power grid, and took 2 steps toward the door. The shadows around him split like an open wound. They surged upward, enveloping his body before I could even shout. For a second, I saw his face, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream, before he was dragged into the corner of the room. Then the light steadied. Dyer was gone. No sound, no trace, just gone. The other crewman and I stared at each other, both pale, both shaking. Neither of us spoke about it. We simply finished the game in silence, cards trembling in our hands until the shift ended. Later, the captain gathered us in the galley and said only, "Remember the rules." Dyer forgot. Don't be Dyer. After that, the tension in the station grew unbearable. Every flicker felt like a death sentence waiting to happen. We all froze at once when it came, standing like statues in whatever positions we were in, counting together under our breaths. The strangest part was that even the air seemed to pause during those moments, as though the station itself held still to keep us safe. But not everyone believed the rule was unbreakable. Roe, the diver who vanished into the galley reflection, had once insisted that the flickers were just power fluctuations. I remembered her scoffing before she disappeared, mocking the idea of counting. After Dyer's fate, her words echoed in my head, taunting me. I began to wonder if I would be next, if my own hesitation would betray me one day. The worst incident came during a maintenance shift in the eastern wing. I was with Harrow and 2 others when the lights sputtered. We froze instantly, counting, but one of the younger recruits panicked. He dropped his wrench, and the clang echoed like thunder in the still corridor. His lips moved too fast. He was skipping numbers, rushing. By the time I reached 7, he bolted forward, desperate to make it out. The walls rippled like liquid, and something vast and formless slipped free. It was a distortion, a wrongness that bent the air itself. It swallowed him in silence, folding him into nothingness. We couldn't even scream, because if we broke the count, we might follow him. Somehow, we finished 10, and the thing vanished, leaving the wrench spinning on the floor. We told no one. The station didn't need more fear than it already held. But that night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the flickering shadows cast by the emergency lamp, replaying the moment over and over. How close had I been to breaking? How many more chances would I get before it was my turn? Each day after, the flickers came more often. Sometimes once, sometimes 3 or 4 times an hour. It was as if something in the trench had noticed us at last, testing the strength of our resolve. My heart lived in my throat, waiting for the lights to dim, for the air to twist, for the shadows to reach, and always, I counted. But on the 14th day, something different happened. The lights flickered as usual, and we froze, counting. 1, 2, 3, but at 4, I heard it. A voice soft and low, whispering my name. I clenched my jaw and kept counting. At 6, The voice grew louder, urging me to turn, to see. By 8, it was shouting, a sound like Ellis, like Rowe, like Dyer, all screaming at once. My hands shook, my breath tore at my chest, but I didn't move. 9, 10. The light steadied, and the voices stopped, but I knew now the rules were evolving. The thing behind the flickers had learned our habits. It had learned how to speak, and it wasn't going to stop. Sleep came rarely in the trench. The station hummed and groaned, pipes shuddered with unseen pressures, and the ocean pressed against the walls like a living weight. But nothing unsettled me more than the hours after midnight, when the air felt heavier and the silence turned sharp. That was when I finally understood Rule 6. Never answer the knocking after midnight. At first I thought it was just the structure shifting. Old metal complained under the strain of 7 miles of water above it, so a few thuds here and there made sense. But the knocks I began hearing were deliberate. 3 slow taps, always in rhythm, always just loud enough to make my skin prickle. They came from the walls of my quarters, from the floor beneath my bunk, sometimes even from the ceiling above. The first time it happened, I sat up in bed, holding my breath. I thought maybe one of the crew had come to get me. But when I opened the door, the corridor was empty. The silence there was thicker, almost suffocating. I shut the door and tried to sleep again, convincing myself it was nothing. But the knocking came back, louder, closer, until it sounded like someone rapping their knuckles directly on the inside of the wall beside my head. I nearly called out, but then I remembered the rule. My throat went dry. I forced myself to stay silent, lying rigid in the bunk, as the knocks continued, always 3 at a time, always patient. Eventually, they stopped. I didn't sleep a single minute that night. The next morning, I asked Harrow if he'd heard them too. His face paled instantly. "Don't talk about it," he snapped, his voice sharp and fearful. "The rule's there for a reason. If it knocks, it already knows where you are. But answering gives it permission." He didn't elaborate further, but the look in his eyes was enough to silence me. Over the following nights, the knocking became part of my routine. Midnight came, and like clockwork, the knocks followed. Sometimes they started faint, distant, as if echoing through the bulkheads. Other times, they were sharp and close, right beside my bed. Each time I froze, biting down on the urge to respond. I counted breaths, dug my nails into my palms, anything to resist. Eventually, the knocks would fade, but I always felt watched, as if something waited just beyond the walls, patient and hungry. Not everyone resisted. There was a communications officer, Jensen, who had been on the station longer than I had. He was quiet, reserved, but restless. One night I heard him muttering through the thin walls, his voice low and weary. Then faintly came the knocks. 3, then silence. Jensen answered. "Hello? Who's there?" I pressed my ear to the wall, heart racing. At first silence, then a voice, faint but clear, replied. It wasn't human, though it mimicked one. Its tone was too flat, its cadence too precise, like words spoken from a script. It said his name, again and again, until Jensen's voice broke, begging, whispering questions I couldn't hear. The following morning, his bunk was empty. His belongings remained, but Jensen himself was gone. The captain called it an accident, claimed Jensen must have wandered into a pressurized chamber by mistake, but no one believed it. We knew he had answered, and whatever was on the other side of the wall had claimed him. After that, the knocks grew bolder. They didn't stop at 3 anymore. They repeated in sets, as if impatient. Some nights they moved from wall to wall, circling me, until I felt surrounded. I stuffed rags in my ears, buried my head under the blanket, but the vibrations still reached me, rattling through the frame of the bunk. Then one night, the pattern changed. Instead of 3 knocks, I heard a single heavy thud, then silence, then a whisper. It was Ellis's voice, clear as day, calling my name from the other side of the wall. My stomach twisted. I wanted so badly to respond, to ask how he was speaking when I'd seen him vanish weeks before. But I stayed silent, shaking, clutching the sheets until my knuckles ached. The whisper turned into pleading, Ellis begging me to let him in, promising he wasn't dead, promising he just needed help. His voice cracked with desperation, and for a moment, tears stung my eyes. I nearly answered. But then I heard another voice, layered beneath his, deeper and wrong. It repeated my name in unison with his, like an echo in a cavern. That broke me. I clamped my jaw shut and refused to move until dawn. By morning the whispers were gone, but the wall beside my bunk bore 3 fresh dents, perfectly round, like the imprint of knuckles. I didn't tell anyone. They didn't need to know how close I had come to breaking. The crew began sleeping in shifts, pairing up in bunks so no one would face the knocking alone. But the rules demanded silence, and silence meant isolation. Even with someone inches away, no one dared speak or comfort each other when the knocks came. The sounds turned us into statues in the dark, each locked in our own prison of fear. One night, I woke to find Harrow sitting upright in his bunk across the room, eyes wide, staring at the wall. The knocking had started again, steady and patient. He was sweating, whispering under his breath, his lips trembling. I realized too late he was answering, not with words, but with movement, nodding, shaking his head, silently communicating with whatever waited outside. I wanted to stop him, but fear nailed me to the mattress. His body jerked once, twice, then went limp. By morning Harrow was gone, leaving only an impression in the sheets where he had lain. The knocks that night were louder than ever, as if celebrating. Now each time I hear them, I wonder how long I can resist. The patience of whatever waits beyond the walls seems infinite, but mine is not. The knocks feel heavier each night, closer, like fists pounding just beneath the surface of the metal. One night soon, I fear I will break, and when I do, there will be no one left to remember me, no one left to follow the rules. The observation deck was supposed to be the heart of the station, a marvel of design that gave us a view few humans had ever seen. Massive reinforced glass panes stretched across the wall, showing the endless black of the Mariana Trench, broken only by occasional pinpricks of strange bioluminescence. In daylight, it was eerie but beautiful. At night, it became something else entirely, which was why I learned to respect Rule 7. Do not look directly into the observation windows after dark. At first, the rule felt paranoid. The windows were the only reminder of the outside world, the only proof that the sea existed beyond the claustrophobic corridors. Many of us sat there during breaks, pressing our faces close to the glass, watching the flicker of glowing creatures drifting past. But after Ellis, Rowe, Jensen, and Harrow were gone, fewer crew lingered there. I didn't understand why, until I broke the rule myself. It happened during one of my late-night cleaning duties. The galley had finally quieted, and I wandered toward the observation deck, hoping to clear my mind. The station was silent, except for the groan of pressure against its frame. I told myself a few minutes staring into the void might calm me, but as soon as I stepped onto the deck, I felt it, the heavy pull of the dark water, as if it were pressing directly against my chest. The windows gleamed faintly, reflecting my own face back at me. I knew the rule, I knew I shouldn't, but loneliness gnawed at me, and curiosity burned worse than fear. I leaned forward and looked. For a moment, all I saw was blackness, vast and endless. Then shapes began to emerge. At first, I thought they were fish, pale flashes of light drifting lazily past. But they weren't fish, they were faces. Dozens, maybe hundreds, floating in the water outside. Pale, human faces, eyes wide and unblinking, mouths slack. They hovered there, illuminated by a faint glow from within, their features distorted, but unmistakably human. My stomach dropped as I recognized some of them. Ellis, Rowe, even Jensen, staring at me through the glass. I staggered back, but the faces pressed closer, noses almost against the pane, eyes locked on mine. Their mouths began to move in unison, forming words I couldn't hear, but I felt them in my chest, vibrating like a second heartbeat. I clutched my ears, shut my eyes, but the words pulsed inside me, begging me to join them, promising it wasn't too late. The lights flickered then, and for a heartbeat, the faces vanished. When they returned, there was only one left, Harrow. His features were calm, his mouth curved in a sad smile. His hand pressed against the glass, and for a second, I almost raised my own to meet it. Then I remembered the rule. I ripped my gaze away, heart hammering, and stumbled out of the deck, refusing to look back. The next morning, the captain pulled me aside. His eyes were bloodshot, his face drawn. "You looked, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer, but he didn't need me to. He sighed. "They don't leave you alone after that. Not entirely. Whatever they are, they want you to follow, to go out there with them." He didn't say more, but the exhaustion in his tone told me he knew what I'd seen. After that night, the faces followed me. Not literally, not at first, but in reflections, in the sheen of water pooled on the floor, in the polished edge of a knife. Always the same pale features, always those unblinking eyes. Sometimes they whispered, faint and muffled, as though carried through miles of water. Other times they screamed, silent but furious, mouths stretched wider than they should be. One evening, I caught another crewman breaking the rule. She stood in the observation deck, forehead pressed to the glass, whispering a conversation with something outside. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw her tears. I pulled her away, but the damage was done. That night, she didn't return to her bunk. We searched the station, but she was gone. The windows were clear when we checked them, too clear, as if freshly cleaned. From then on, the observation deck stayed locked after dark. Still, I sometimes caught crew lingering near it, staring through the glass as though hypnotized. It was like the ocean itself called to them, dragging their will away, piece by piece. I feared the same was happening to me. The worst moment came when I woke to find my own reflection, sitting upright across the bunk room, staring at me with dead eyes. I blinked, and it was gone. But I knew it hadn't been a dream. The faces outside had wormed their way in, waiting for the right moment to pull me closer. Now I avoid the deck completely, even in daylight. The darkness beyond feels alive, pressing its hunger against the glass. Sometimes I hear faint thuds during the night, like hands striking the window from the other side. I don't look, I won't look, but I know one day, the temptation will break me. The trench doesn't forget, it doesn't forgive, and the faces outside are waiting, patient and endless. The water tanks were the lifeline of the station, towering cylinders that filtered and stored the very liquid, keeping us alive. They hissed and hummed constantly, a mechanical heartbeat echoing through the narrow maintenance corridors. At first I thought nothing of them. They were just machines, part of the endless background noise of survival. But then I came to understand Rule 8. Never go near the water tanks when you're alone. The tanks had always unnerved me, though I couldn't explain why. The water inside wasn't clear like it should have been. It was murky, faintly luminous, as though something lived in it beyond filters and pipes. Sometimes, when I passed them, I swore I saw shapes moving in the depths, twisting too slowly to be mechanical malfunctions. The others avoided them, unless duty forced their hand. And when we went in pairs, always in pairs. My first mistake was curiosity. During a late shift, I heard the steady hiss of the tanks turn irregular, like something scraping against the metal walls from within. Everyone else was asleep, and against better judgment, I grabbed a wrench and went to check. The corridors near the tanks were colder, the air heavier with condensation. My breath fogged as I approached, and the hum of machinery seemed almost muted, as though muffled by the water itself. I pressed my ear to the steel, straining to hear. What I caught made my blood freeze. A voice, faint and distorted, whispering from inside the tank. My name, repeated, soft but insistent, bubbling as though spoken underwater. I stumbled back, heart hammering, but the whisper grew clearer, as though it had followed me out. I forced myself to walk away, but my reflection in the condensation of the tank wall lingered half a second too long, lips still moving, even when mine had stopped. The next day, I didn't mention it, but during breakfast, one of the divers admitted he'd been hearing things too. Voices calling from the tanks. Familiar voices. Friends, family, even lovers long dead. No one laughed. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, the captain said, "That's why the rule exists. You hear it because you're alone. It waits until then." His tone allowed no argument, and we all nodded grimly. But the rule wasn't enough to save us all. One evening, a technician named Brant went missing. We searched everywhere, his bunk, the galley, the rec room, but he was gone. The last place anyone had seen him was near the tanks. When we checked, one of the access hatches stood open, dripping water onto the floor. The surface inside rippled, though none of us touched it. I swear I saw a hand press up against the glass from inside, pale and trembling, before vanishing into the murk. After that, the tanks became sacred ground we avoided unless duty demanded. Even then, no one lingered. I began to dread the way the water glowed faintly at night, a sickly light that pulsed as though in rhythm with our own heartbeats. Sometimes I thought I heard splashing inside, though there should have been nothing but stillness. Once I walked past and caught the reflection of a face in the glass. My face, but with hollow eyes and a mouth stretched impossibly wide. The fear worsened when the tanks began to smell wrong. The water we drank tasted metallic, like blood, though the filters showed nothing unusual. The captain ordered rationing, and paranoia spread like fire. Some crew refused to drink, whispering that the tanks had been corrupted, that something from the trench had seeped inside. Others claimed to feel stronger after drinking, their eyes glassy, their hands trembling as though charged with some unseen energy. One night, I woke to find one of those men, Tallis, a mechanic, standing in the corridor outside the tanks. His face was pressed against the glass, eyes wide, lips moving silently as though in conversation with something unseen. I called his name, but he didn't respond. Only when I touched his shoulder did he turn. His eyes were black, pupils blown wide, and his mouth opened as if to speak. But instead, water spilled out, rushing over his lips and down his chin. He collapsed, convulsing, and when he finally stilled, his chest didn't rise again. We didn't bury him. The captain ordered his body sealed in a storage chamber far from the tanks. But even then, I swear I heard water dripping behind the door, though it was dry. The tanks hummed louder that night, almost like laughter. Now whenever I pass them, I keep my head down. I don't look at the condensation, don't listen to the whispers, don't breathe too deep. Still, sometimes I feel the pull, a pressure like gravity dragging me toward the hatch. The voices are patient, familiar, always just at the edge of hearing. They promise warmth, reunion, an end to the endless cold. But I've seen what happens to those who listen. Brant swallowed whole, Tallis drowned from the inside. Others vanished without a trace, leaving only ripples in the water and reflections that weren't theirs. The tanks aren't just machines, they're mouths, and one day, they'll swallow us all if the rules slip. For now I cling to silence, to distance, to the fragile safety of company, but I know the truth, deep down. Rules aren't shields, they're bargains, and every bargain has an end. The hull of the station is our skin, the only thing between us and 10,000 tons of crushing black. It groans constantly, settling like old bones under the weight of the trench. At first, the sounds unnerved me, but I grew used to them. Metal expanding, contracting, protesting quietly against the endless pressure. That's natural. What isn't natural is when the sounds turn rhythmic. The first time it happened, I nearly convinced myself it was my imagination, until the captain reminded us of Rule 9. If you hear knocking on the hull, never answer it. The knocks began faint, 3 in a row. Tap, 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 tap. They echoed through the corridors, subtle yet deliberate, like knuckles against a door. I froze where I stood, tools clutched in my hand, listening as the sound traveled along the hull, moving slowly, methodically, as though something was walking its fingers across our skin. My instinct was to tap back, to signal someone out there, maybe a diver stranded, begging for help. But my throat tightened, and I remembered the rule. I forced myself away. Later, over dinner, I asked the crew if they'd heard it too. The table went quiet. One by one, eyes shifted to the captain. He didn't look up from his tray as he muttered, "We don't talk about it. We don't answer. Not unless you want to open the door and invite it inside." The others nodded grimly, and the conversation changed, but I noticed the way their hands trembled when they held their cups. Still, my curiosity gnawed at me. Who or what was knocking? The next time it came, louder this time, 5 knocks in a steady rhythm. I pressed my ear to the steel. At first, it sounded hollow, like the tapping of stone on metal, but then I heard something else. A faint echo, a voice carried through the vibrations. It was muffled, distorted by water and distance, but unmistakably human. My name. I stumbled back, heart pounding. My name again, clearer now, each syllable drawn out, as if from someone I knew. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. The sound pulled at me, a lure made of memory. Against my will, my hand drifted to the emergency release lever. Just one pull, I thought, and I could see who was out there. But then another sound cut through, the unmistakable groan of the captain's boots behind me. He slammed the lever back into place, his face pale. "Don't listen. That's how it gets you." That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay awake in my bunk, listening to the steady rhythm of knocks, traveling along the hull, circling us like a predator. The sound grew sharper near the crew quarters, then faded, only to return near the tanks, the lab, the galley. It moved with purpose, as though mapping us, testing for weakness. I covered my ears, but the vibrations crawled through the mattress, humming in my bones. We lost the first man 2 weeks later. His name was Harris, a radio operator. He swore he heard his daughter's voice outside, calling to him. He insisted she'd been lost years ago, drowned in a boating accident, but the voice, it was hers. He ignored the rule. He went to the outer hatch. When we found him, the hatch was sealed, no alarms triggered, no breach recorded. He was simply gone. All that remained was his headset, lying on the floor, still buzzing faintly with static. The knocking intensified, after that, as if pleased. Louder, faster, sometimes playful, other times furious, like fists pounding in rage. Once, during a blackout, I swear I saw the hull bend inward, a dent the size of a hand pressed against the steel. The lights flickered, and in the brief flash, I thought I saw the outline of a face, pressing close to the glass of a porthole. Not human, not anything that belonged in water. Paranoia spread through us. Every sound became suspect. A dropped wrench echoed like doom, a creak in the pipes, like footsteps in the walls. We began sleeping in shifts, never leaving anyone alone near the outer edges of the station. Still the knocks came, always at night, always when we were weakest. One evening, I passed the observation deck and froze. Through the thick reinforced glass, in the faint glow of our floodlights, I saw something moving, a silhouette drifting just beyond the light's edge. Human in shape, but wrong. Its limbs were too long, bending oddly as it swam with impossible slowness. Then, as if sensing me, it stopped. Its head tilted, and in the silence that followed, 3 sharp knocks rang against the glass, inches from my face. I couldn't breathe. The silhouette pressed closer, pale features flickering into view. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted in a grotesque smile. Then it was gone, swallowed by the black. But the knocks lingered, echoing through my skull. I staggered back, retching, the taste of salt water in my throat. After that, the captain tightened protocols. No one was allowed near the hull at night. Doors were sealed, Lights dimmed, conversations hushed. Still the knocks never stopped. They grew bolder, louder, sometimes mimicking patterns we recognized. Morse code, emergency signals, even the exact rhythm of Harris's laugh. Once, they copied the captain's voice, knocking out his words in perfect time. It became unbearable. Some crew stuffed rags in their ears. Others started whispering to themselves, muttering prayers or curses to drown out the noise. I tried to ignore it, but the more I resisted, the clearer it became. It wasn't just sound anymore. It was thought. The knocks began to shape words in my mind. Intrusive, insistent, let us in. We're cold, we're waiting. The night I almost broke, I stood in front of the hatch, hands trembling on the lever. Behind the steel, the knocks came fast, frantic, like fists begging for mercy. My mother's voice called my name, begging me to help her, to open the door, to save her. I knew it wasn't real. She'd been dead for years, but grief is a predator too, and it uses every weakness. I don't remember how long I stood there, tears blurring my vision, fingers tightening on the release. All I know is that something, some scrap of will, dragged me back. I collapsed in the corridor, sobbing, while the knocks slowed, fading into silence. For now, but silence is worse. Silence means it's waiting, patient as the trench itself, and I know it will return, louder, stronger, until one of us breaks again. Because rules aren't just warnings, they're chains, and chains rust. When the station dipped into another power crisis, rationing became brutal. Hallways were dimmed, labs shut down, and even the sleeping quarters flickered with the barest glow. The engineers begged to cut more systems, claiming we couldn't sustain the drains. But the captain refused one thing above all, the galley lights. He made it clear, drilling into us every chance he got. Rule 10. Never turn off the galley lights, no matter the power shortage. I didn't understand why at first. The galley wasn't special, just a cramped kitchen with cold counters, bolted stools, and shelves of preserved rations. But to him, it was sacred. I learned why on a night when the emergency reserves were running so thin that even the hum of the generators seemed tired. I sat alone in the galley, chewing through a dry protein bar when the overhead bulbs flickered. Just once, but enough to draw every muscle in my body tight. The galley felt different in that moment, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. My reflection in the window, warped, twisted, and for a split second I swore I saw someone else staring back. A second face, pale and sunken, its lips moving silently. Then the bulb steadied, humming back to life. I told myself it was fatigue. The next morning, Walker, one of the junior engineers, suggested shutting off the galley to conserve what was left. The captain nearly tore him apart in front of us all, shouting until spittle flew. His rage didn't feel like anger. It felt like fear, pure and raw. You'd rather starve in the dark than know what comes when that room goes black, he muttered, his voice cracking. Nobody challenged him again. Still, Walker couldn't hide the resentment in his eyes. That resentment grew into desperation. 2 nights later, when my shift ended, I stumbled into the corridor and saw the glow of the galley gone. My heart seized. I sprinted through the halls, breath ragged, the air colder than usual. When I shoved the galley door open, the room was pitch black, not even the faint outlines of the tables visible. But I wasn't alone. I heard something move inside, slow, dragging, wet, like flesh pulling across tile. My lungs locked as I reached for the switch, slamming it back on. The lights flared, revealing Walker standing by the counter, trembling. His skin looked clammy, his eyes wild. It spoke to me, he whispered. From the dark, it told me the trench has mouths, and they're always hungry. His hands shook as he pointed to the sink. I followed his gaze and froze. The drain was coated in a slick black residue, thick as tar. It pulsed faintly, as if breathing. I gagged, fumbling backward, but Walker only laughed, his voice hollow. The captain dragged Walker out, locking him in isolation. by morning he was gone. His cell was empty, no signs of a struggle, no breach in the doors, only a trail of wet footprints led back toward the galley. We never found him again. After that, no one questioned the lights, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. That residue clung to my memory, oozing in every nightmare. Each time the galley lights flickered after, I felt the same cold breath on my neck, the same awareness that something waited just beyond the glow. The others felt it too. Meals became silent affairs, the crew keeping their eyes fixed on their plates, refusing to glance toward the corners where shadows pressed thick and heavy. Then came the blackout. A storm above severed the main power lines, plunging half the station into chaos. Emergency systems kicked in, but the lights in the galley sputtered like dying stars. We huddled inside, the captain clutching a lantern, his jaw clenched. In the wavering light, the shadows seemed alive, stretching and bending unnaturally. One of them detached itself from the wall, rippling like liquid. A voice whispered, soft and coaxing, from the darkness. Not one voice, dozens, layered and overlapping, some familiar, some impossibly ancient. They promised warmth, escape, even reunion with lost loved ones. The crew shifted nervously, some weeping silently, others pressing their palms to their ears. I gripped the counter so hard, my nails tore. The captain roared at us, forcing us to focus, forcing the lantern higher. Stay in the light. Don't listen, he bellowed. But the voices laughed in reply, an endless chorus that scraped my bones raw. Then with one final flicker, the galley bulbs steadied. The shadows shrank, retreating as though burned, and the room fell into stunned silence. Later, when the storm passed and the systems recovered, I asked the captain what exactly lived in the dark. He stared at me, his eyes hollowed by exhaustion, and said only, "The trench remembers every meal it's ever had, and it wants more." I didn't press him. I couldn't, because in that silence I realized something chilling. The voices I'd heard weren't strangers. They were the voices of my own family, speaking words they'd never said in life. The trench didn't just hunger for flesh, it devoured memory, and it had been feeding far longer than we knew. From then on, every flicker of those galley lights filled me with terror, because each time I feared it wasn't just a storm or a failing generator. Each time I feared it was the trench, reaching through the cracks, trying again, and I knew one day it would succeed. The rules had always felt like a chain dragging us deeper into paranoia, but nothing compared to the weight of the final one. The first time I heard it, I laughed, thinking it meant something trivial about hunger or rationing. But the captain's face carried no humor when he explained it. He spoke slowly, voice low, as if saying it too loudly might summon whatever waited. His words stuck with me, even as I tried to dismiss them. Rule 11. If the last plate is empty, don't stay for what comes next. Meals in the station were never grand. Preserved rations, powdered soups, and occasional protein slabs that barely passed as meat. Still, the galley became our anchor, the one place where routine kept us tethered to something human. But as the weeks bled into months, the tension of the rules hollowed us out. Every seat at the table felt like a coffin waiting to close. Every spoonful of food a gamble we weren't sure we wanted to take, and yet we obeyed. The first time the last plate came empty was during a supply delay. We sat together in silence, trays lined with thin portions, one by one plates emptied, and when the final dish sat bare, untouched, something shifted in the room. The hum of the galley lights faltered, and a chill seeped through the vents. Nobody moved. We all stared at the empty plate, waiting. The captain was the first to rise, motioning us out quickly. "Don't linger," he whispered, his face gray. We left without protest, but Walker wasn't with us anymore, and Harris was gone too. And curiosity has a way of festering in grief. 2 nights later, Ortiz, a diver with more stubbornness than sense, decided he wanted to see what happened if he stayed behind. He claimed we were all prisoners of fear, chained by rules written by cowards. I watched him grin, tossing his tray aside as he leaned back in his chair. "If the trench wants me," he said, "let it come collect me." Then he waved us off, refusing to move. We sealed the galley doors behind us, the captain's hand trembling as he locked them. The silence that followed pressed like a weight on my skull. We waited in the corridor, none daring to speak, until a sound drifted from inside. Not the familiar hum of machinery, not the whisper of pipes. This was heavier. A scrape, long and slow, as though something vast was dragging itself across tile. Then a sound like chairs toppling. Ortiz screamed once, sharp, cut short, and then silence. When the captain opened the doors again, the galley was immaculate. No overturned chairs, no spilled trays, no trace of Ortiz. Only the last plate, still empty, sitting in the middle of the table as though waiting for someone new. We didn't eat for a full day after that. None of us could. From then on, we treated every meal like ritual. We finished our food quickly, rising before the final plate cleared, rushing from the galley before the silence grew too heavy. But no matter how careful we were, accidents happened. A plate scraped bare too soon, a portion too small to stretch. Each time it did, the air grew colder, and something moved just beyond the edges of sight. Shadows that bent wrong, reflections in the glass that smiled when we didn't. We obeyed the rule, fleeing before the room could trap us. I couldn't stop thinking about what Ortiz had seen. Had something emerged from the walls, from the floor, from the very air, or worse, had it come from inside him? My dreams answered for me. I saw the galley dark and still, the empty plate glowing faintly under the lights, and from it something rose, a figure with no face. Its skin stretched thin, dripping brine. Its arms were too long, and in its hands it carried not food, but fragments of bone still wet. The nightmare left me gasping, drenched in sweat, but I knew it wasn't just a dream. The trench had a way of planting seeds in our minds, showing us its hunger before it fed, and that hunger was growing. One night, the rule nearly broke me. Supplies had dwindled to crumbs, and when my tray emptied, I noticed the last plate still untouched. The others filed out quickly, but I lingered, my stomach a knot of fire. The thought of food, even scraps, was unbearable to resist. I stared at that plate, my hand trembling as I reached for it, and then the lights flickered. The reflection in the galley window warped again. Not my face this time, but Ortiz's. His eyes were hollow, his mouth stretched into a grin too wide, skin sagging like soaked parchment. He mouthed words I couldn't hear, but I understood all the same. "Stay, watch." The light steadied, and I bolted from the room, heart hammering like a drum. The captain's glare met me outside. He didn't need to ask what I'd done. The trench had marked me, and he knew it. "Next time," he said softly, "it won't let you leave." Now as I sit here writing this, I can feel the pull of that last rule. The galley is quiet, too quiet, and I know the final plate is waiting again. I can almost hear the scrape, slow and deliberate, moving closer each second I delay. The air is colder now, the lights trembling on their wires, and every instinct in me screams to run. But hunger is cruel, and curiosity worse. If you ever find yourself here, remember this: rules aren't suggestions. They're lifelines. Break them, and the trench won't just take your body, it will take your name, your voice, your place at the table. And when the last plate is empty, something else will sit down to eat.